Pegninda, Zaganash, Kweninda, and Winnipeg Ninduji, which is to say, my name is Adele Perry. I don't know my clan. I live in Winnipeg and I am a white settler woman, and I am also the academic director of the Center for Human Rights Research. And it is in that capacity that it is my real honor to have an opportunity to be a part of this remarkable panel that you are all logging in for or watching in some other way on human rights in resistance in 2021. And I come to you here from not far from the Red River, from the territories of the Anishinaabe and Innu people, and of the Métis people, governed by the promises of Treaty 1 and also of the Manitoba Act, what Riel and some of his contemporaries referred to as the Métis Treaty. December 10 today has been marked as Human Rights Day since 1950 and commemorates the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for all the cozy images of a homogenous mid-century world, this was a time of inequity, disease, and the constant and difficult process of making change. In 1950, the UN Refugee Convention was established, one of the many responses to the upheavals and massive movements in human populations that followed World War II. Closer to these territories where we are right now, the 1950s were when the Métis community of Roostertown was dispossessed to make way for a shopping center, a high school, and a swimming pool. The polio pandemic that had begun decades earlier had its worst years around 1950. So our knowledge today is the first time the Center for Human Rights Research, which was established in 2012, has marked Human Rights Day. And it's also the first time I think that the city of Winnipeg has done so, and we're being honored to be being live streamed to their event, and say hello to everybody there at the Center for at the Museum for Human Rights. And today we are honored to draw together 5 really remarkable and accomplished speakers from the front lines of human rights and Indigenous rights activism, programming, service, and research. Our theme is human rights and resistance in 20 and 21. And what a year this has been. It is the second year of a global pandemic that has cost lives, especially Brown, Black, and Indigenous ones. We have seen human movements, both small and large, been limited, and hard-fought gains in women's workplace experiences rolled back with remarkable ease and so little comment. We have also seen new and world-changing solidarity and action. This includes the confirmation of long-standing Indigenous knowledge about the extent of unmarked children's graves at residential schools on both sides of the border, and the youth and survivor-led movement of Every Child Matters. It includes the movement for Black Lives Matters and calls for police accountability in much of the quote unquote former empire, and of restricting a women's rights to reproductive health in the US and the galvanizing response. It includes unprecedented refugee and migrant flows in Europe and illegal, politically motivated and nationalist restrictions for asylum, which is being met by public resistance to those restrictions. It includes the long-awaited and long-fought-for COVID vaccine rollout and its unequal distribution and the consequences of this inequality, both here and abroad. It includes the fall of Afghanistan again, of the racist treatment, neglect, and ultimately death of Indigenous peoples, including Joyce Isha Khan in a Quebec hospital, and her refusal to stay silent even in death, and the Islamophobic murders in London, Ontario, and demands by Muslims and their allies for a national response. These are just some of the moments in the history of human rights and resistance in 2021. Today, our 5 speakers will take on a couple of kind of core questions, which everybody will speak to, and then a few questions that they will kind of dive into more specifically. This will create a conversation that links the local and the global, sees connections without papering over differences, and prompts us to think not just about violations, but also resistance and strategies and possibilities. This conversation today brings together thinkers, activists, professors, practitioners, lawyers, parents, and people who wear many hats. people who may not have the same views or perspective or set of experiences, but who are engaging and trying to make human rights and Indigenous rights more than a reality for many people. And it is a chance for us to learn from one another and to strategize with one another. I want to introduce our five really remarkable speakers in alphabetical order. And then we will then move on to our questions. And I will begin with Idris El Bakri, who is speaking to us as a member of the City of Winnipeg Human Rights Committee. And he grew up in Palestine, has called Winnipeg home for more than 15 years. Over the years, he has emerged as a voice for Canadian Muslims and Canadian Palestinians in Manitoba, while also supporting a broad range of human rights causes as both a friend and an ally. He is currently on the board of the Manitoba Islamic Association, United Way Winnipeg and Hospitality House, and is a member of the City of Winnipeg's Human Rights Committee. He speaks and writes widely on topics related to Muslims in Manitoba, Islamophobia in Palestine. His passion for freedom and justice is driven by the multi-generational experience of his family and their struggles with colonialism. Professionally, Idris works in healthcare and has an appointment as an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba and the Rady College for Health Sciences. Our next speaker is Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre. Leah Gazan was elected as a Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, my riding, in October of 2019. She is currently the NDP Critic for Women and Gender Equality, the Critic for Children, Families and Social Development, and Deputy Critic for Housing. That's the many hats. In 2019, she introduced a private member's bill, the Climate Emergency Action Act, which recognized the right to a healthy environment as a human right. In August 2020, she submitted M46, which calls on the federal government to convert the Canada Emergency Response Benefit into a permanent guaranteed livable basic income. As an educator, advisor, and media contributor, Leah Gazan has been deeply engaged with issues and organizing in Winnipeg's core for nearly 3 decades. As president of the Social Planning Council between 2011 and 2015, Gazan organized and pushed policy in support of an end to housing, addressing violence against women and girls, finding solutions for housing insecurity, ensuring fair wages, community-based actions, addressing addictions, and proper supports for mental health. Her recent success includes traveling and organizing to push Bill C-262, the Indigenous Human Rights Act. Next, our next speaker after that, and Leah Gazan is a member of Wood Mountain Lakota Nation located in Saskatchewan in Treaty 4 territory. Our next speaker is Aisha Khan, who is CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. She is a lawyer, an educator, and a community leader dedicated to building a culture of human rights in Canada and beyond. She assumed her role as CEO of the CMHR in August of 2020. Born in Winnipeg, she holds degrees from the University of Manitoba and the University of Victoria. She has worked in private practice before returning to lead the institutional development and change management at United Way Winnipeg. She served at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, first as legal counsel and then as executive director, moving forward several important human rights-based initiatives and public education campaigns. Before assuming her role at the museum, she was appointed by the Government of Canada to review conditions of incarcerated people and segregation at federal penitentiaries. Throughout her life, Khan has worked to build communities everywhere and is committed to respecting people to reach their full potential. She continues that work at the museum, engaging people around the world in a growing movement for hope and for human rights. Our next speaker is Brienne Lavallee-Heckert, and she is a member of Red River Echoes. She is a Michif woman with German settler ancestry from the Red River and Treaty 1 territory. Her Michif family is from the Métis community of Saint-Amboise, located on the southern tip of Lake Manitoba. She holds a Bachelor of Arts at Human Rights from the University of Winnipeg, as well as a Bachelor of Civil Law and Juris Doctor from McGill University. Breanne is committed to decolonizing understandings of law through the embodiment of Michif Métis sovereignty and active future building. She's a proud member of Red River Echoes, a growing collective of Michif Métis people who are working towards abolition and land back in Red River. Our next speaker will be Louise Simban-Dunway, founding member of Immigration Matters in Canada Coalition. She has played a lead role in working with partner organizations to develop supporting employment and economic developments, financial empowerment programs. SEED now delivers a range of financial empowerment interventions through a network of over 100 organizations in Manitoba. A former refugee, Louise is passionate about human rights and social justice. Her volunteer commitments include the Public Interest Law Center Advisory Committee, the Immigration Partnership Winnipeg Council, and Immigration Matters in Canada Coalition, and the Police Accountability Coalition. She has served on the Advisory Committee of Manitoba's Poverty Reduction Strategy and the Ministerial Advisory Committee for Canada's first Poverty Reduction Strategy. She has a Bachelor in Commerce from the University of Saskatchewan and a Master's in Comparative Social Research from Oxford University. She has developed and taught innovative courses on financial empowerment, community economic development, and human rights advocacy at the University of Winnipeg. Whoosh, that was a remarkable set of introductions and a real honor to deliver just such a snapshot into a group of people who bring such a wealth of experience and commitments and ideas to this conversation. And with that, I want to begin with our first question, which we'll ask of all of our speakers, beginning with Idris El Bakri, who will go first, to ask us to speak to the question number one, which is, as we usher in the new year, what are the most urgent human rights issues that we should focus on as Canadians, as Manitobans, and as Winnipeggers?
Thank you, Adele, and thank you everybody for being here. I think this is the only time in my life where I wished my last name would start with a Z, not an E. But I will also acknowledge that I stand here in gratitude to the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada. We call it immigrant, a newcomer, and so on, but they're the only ones who call me a relative, and I really, really appreciate that. So I think this is one of the issues that we have to continue to focus on in terms of human rights, is to ensure that we continue to struggle together and support the First Nations, Indigenous Canadians in their struggle to really reclaim what is really theirs and it should have never been taken away from them. I think there's other things like fundamental needs, housing, poverty, education, employment, health, and really people's freedom to express themselves and to realize their potentials. I think the other thing we should think about as we go into the new year is to realize that there's a national and global connectedness to all the issues that we're working on in our separate spheres. They're really overlapping and sometimes extremely overlapping spheres. And we need to explore, understand how things are connected. For example, one of the things that was mentioned earlier was Islamophobia. So if Islamophobia has become a global phenomenon, we have Islamophobia in Canada, in the US. We have it in India today with the government of India depriving the Muslim population there of some of their rights and liberties. We have Islamophobia in China with the Uyghur Muslim nation there being subjected to horrendous violations of human rights. And even here, our government worked so hard to free the two Michaels, but we don't seem to see any movement on freeing Hussein Jalil, who is a Uyghur Canadian who is in prison in China. But I also want us to think about going in about the possible impact that fear could have on human rights moving forward into the next year, into the near future. So I lived in the US for many years. I had a wonderful time there for over a decade. And I was there on 9/11 and in the aftermath of 9/11, and I witnessed people that I knew very closely, friends of mine who were jailed, deported, and even myself had to go and report to the FBI, be interviewed, and entry and exit requirements and so on. So I saw that firsthand, and I'm worried that as the pandemic continues to play with us, we're done with it, it's not done with us, but also as we start to deal with some what could be climate disasters or catastrophes that our society is going to be gripped by fear. And I worry that that fear could lead us to seeing further erosion in human rights as we respond to it as a society. So I think, again, looking at some of the pressing issues, but also stepping back and thinking about whether we're going to be more afraid in the future, in the coming year, and whether that fear is going to lead us to accept concessions on our human rights and to concede some of our freedoms in the name of, some sort of security or safety that we are chasing after. Thanks.
I'll turn things over to Leah Gazan.
Thank you so much. Nice to see my good friend Idris as well, and all of you in the circle. Thank you for the question, Adele. I join you here today on the unceded Algonquin territory, a statement in itself riddled with human rights violations because it's been taken over. There's an acknowledgement and nobody's moving out. And but in any case, that is where I join you from today. That's a really critical question. And, certainly a lot of my work has centered around, the climate crisis as it intersects with fundamental Indigenous rights, something that, a history of genocide in this country that I think reveals itself in what I've been calling a growing corporate dictatorship that privileges corporations over the human rights of peoples, and we witness that whether it is on Turtle Island, Wet'suwet'en Territory, Site C Dam, Muskrat Falls, certainly are current examples, or around the globe, Chile, Palestine, corporations that seem to, have influence over true democracy, even in Canada, I would argue, in terms of really achieving a justice for all. And that growing inequality is revealing itself even in the riding of Winnipeg Centre, where we have a current housing crisis, where we have growing food insecurity and more people than ever that are beginning to use a food bank. The fact that, this current government, without getting too partisan, is currently cutting seniors off, the poorest seniors in this country off guaranteed income supplement, and families living in poverty from the child tax benefit for collecting the CERB or CRB, including in their income, placing people in deeper levels of poverty, making their housing situations more precarious, putting their lives at risk. And at the same moment, funding big oil, letting big corporations off the hook on the backs and human rights of people, and so I think we have a lot of issues, pressing issues. I think we are in a critical juncture. One of the reasons why I decided to run, one of the reasons why I'll continue to push for a guaranteed livable basic income, and one of the reasons why I think it's imperative for all of us to stand with courage in the face of a climate crisis, in the face of human rights violations and growing inequality, because I really believe more than ever, if we want to defend the human rights of people and plant and animal life, then we need a movement. So I'm looking forward to talking about not just our struggles, but how we can work together to build powerful movements. So thanks very much.
Awesome, thank you for those. So we're just, for a couple of people have just joined us since we began the call, and we have each of our speakers addressing one question, which is, as we usher in the new year, what are the most urgent human rights issues that we should focus on as Canadians, as Manitobans, as Winnipeggers? And I will turn things now over to Aisha Khan.
So I echo the issues that both of my fellow panelists raised. I mean, we're talking about relationships with Indigenous people, First Peoples of this land, what that means, intersections of that with climate justice, and I so I abandoned what I was going to say and thought the overlap that Idris spoke about how we do our work, I think is an important one for us to think about and focus on in the year to come, because I think that was the question. So yeah, absolutely. When I think about human rights issues, there are many. I think, like many of you, I think about restoring treaty relationships and living the spirit and intent of those treaties, about learning about Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and how we incorporate that into our lives. And I think about climate and where our planet's going to be and why we need a planet there for us to do the work. We need a planet at the end of the day. And so I think that's important. But what I fear and what I think about when I step back from the issues that we work on is about the division that we see. So the more we become knowledgeable, the more that we raise awareness and we succeed in the work that we do to advocate for human rights, we also see this increasing division and entrenchment of positions. And I think it comes from fear, personally, fear of turf and territory and recognition of the battles that have been fought before us. But I think that one area of focus for us in coming, as we come through this pandemic more than ever, is to find ways to bind us together, to find those ties that bind. Because if we don't do it in our advocacy work, where are we going to get? We've always got a force that we're fighting against. So that's what I think our focus should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn things over to Brienne Lavallee-Heckert.
I see, Adele. Before I answer, I also just want to clarify, I don't identify as a Canadian. So in answering this question, I didn't think of it in that way. But for me, the most pressing human rights issue is land back and respect for Indigenous sovereignty, both here and globally. I think not just settlers, I think, especially as a Métis person, I don't necessarily know if Métis governments recognize this, but we need to accept that Canada is guilty of ongoing genocide, not just here, but globally. Our relatives in Central and South America who are also experiencing the tyranny of Canadian imperialism and Canadian genocide. And so I think we all really need to think very seriously and critically about the fact that we actively, materially benefit from ongoing genocide. I know this is a small example, but as an Indigenous woman, it bothers me to go into a grocery store and to see berries from here, blueberries picked from Peru, where Indigenous women there, who don't have choices are picking food for me that, like just small things like that everyday things, we don't realize the very tangible ways that we're benefiting from that genocide. And we need to take that seriously. Choices need to be made about the way that we're living our lives as individuals. We know that the government, we know the corporations, they don't care. We know that that's the case. We have to start mobilizing in community. So I think Canadians are very comfortable and polite with their land acknowledgements, but as an Indigenous young person, I've grown up listening to those land acknowledgements, and I believe they're true. This is my land, and I will do whatever it takes to defend it. And I know that there are Indigenous youth all over the world who feel the same. So I think there is hope for the human rights issues that we're facing, and it's in the young people. Marcy.
Thank you very much. Our last panelist with this alphabetical order we're moving on to take on this first question is Louise. So I'll turn things over to her.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot more to add. I think Adele did an amazing job and covered a lot of territory in terms of the issues, and my fellow panelists, all of the issues you raised really resonated with me. And like Idris, I am really humbled when I think about having been able to find refuge here in Canada, and then just recognizing that the First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, have been disenfranchised in so many ways, and just the enormity of the injustice that has been done is continuing to be perpetuated, and recognizing my obligation as someone that has directly benefited from that to try and work with others to address that in a meaningful way, by responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and really taking on and listening and following the lead of leaders from the Indigenous communities in terms of amplifying what they're advocating for. So I think that is incredibly critical. The other comments that really resonated for me were how much fear and division are driving people's political commitments. And I'm maybe a little bit naive and idealistic in this, but I think that one of the antidotes is to really dig down deep in terms of meaningful human rights education, and really building an understanding and a deep commitment to the full range of human rights: political, social, cultural, and economic. And the recognition that they're indivisible and interdependent, and that this needs to be the primary lens that informs our actions and political commitments instead of the other way around. I see that we're living in a world where increasingly people are adopting a selective understanding of human rights and almost using in a very selective way human rights as a bludgeon to defend political commitments, to get further entrenched in the politics of fear and division. And so I just really want to be part of building an ethos that is based on fundamental human rights principles. Health equity has really come to the foreground for me, and obviously a clear intersection between that and social and economic inclusion. As someone that came from a country where who you were determined whether you lived or died on a particular night or day, we're living now in a world where it's obvious that who you are, the economic resources that you have, where you're located, will determine whether or not you live and die from this pandemic. And it just laid bare a dynamic that already existed, where life expectancy is absolutely linked to issues of economic equity, and corporations like Leah, Brianna, you're absolutely right. Like our current economic system and the role that corporations play in all of this is something else that needs to be addressed. And finally, just something that I think has been really hidden from view, because the pandemic is on our news feeds 24/7, is the issue of refugees. Over 84 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Many of those are children, and I'm just thinking about just how vulnerable they are. And just a tiny fraction, like 143,000, have been resettled over the last year in terms of finding a permanent solution, or a more durable solution that my family was able to find here in Canada. And so I think about that and the need to work on that. So lots of challenges, lots of issues.
Thank you very much for everybody for those really remarkable responses to that first question. Now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and have each of our panelists speak to one question that they have selected that was either submitted or generated from a fellow panelist. And I'll ask the speakers to read the question out, just to remind the listeners, the viewers, and remind all of us what question they're speaking to. And I'll first pass things over to Idris.
Thank you again. The question was, what are the most promising avenues for Indigenous and newcomer solidarity? And the question caught my attention because, again, some people call me newcomers, immigrant, and Indigenous brothers and sisters call me a relative. And I think what came to my mind was that the falsehood starts offshore. The narrative starts offshore, and it's a false narrative. And I think many newcomers especially those coming through the the formal channels of the government, are coming without with either having already accepted a certain narrative about Indigenous peoples of Canada, or at least, or at best, no real awareness of the issues that we have here in Canada as far as that is concerned. And I just couldn't help but try to imagine if immigration policy and implementation of that policy was actually led by newcomers and Indigenous peoples, as opposed by more Eurocentric system. I think that things would look very, very different. So just maybe something to imagine, to dream about, to work for. Some of the encouraging avenues that I've seen, and I think Louise has been involved in some of this. There's been some really good initiatives from both communities to try to get to know each other better, to understand their shared humanity and how they need to be allies and supporters of each other. I think one thing that has helped me personally was to realize that there's a lot of parallels. So many newcomers, many immigrants are coming from post-colonial countries and post-colonial societies. In my case, still a colonized country. And there are a lot of parallels in that colonial history between Canada and many parts of the world. I think newcomers or immigrants are trying to get access, and unfortunately, oftentimes that access, they're desiring access to be accepted in sort of the broadest or the European segment of society, the settler society. And what I find is promising is that the younger generations of those families and those newcomers and immigrants are challenging that. I think they are seeing that morally is not enough, and they are seeing that their destiny is closely tied to the destiny and to the future of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass things over to Leah Gazan, who is going to be taking on another question, and I'll let her read it out.
Thank you so much, Adele. So I wanted to respond to, the question about resistance. If I believe that resistance is central to the advancement of rights. So here's what I have to say about resistance. I think I'm a well-known resistor. I'll start out there. So I'll give you my thoughts about resistance. I think change is really uncomfortable. I think if you want to change systems, it takes courage. It takes courage from people who will benefit from the change. And it also takes courage from people who have to make adjustments to achieve that change. And I think in the moment of fighting for that change and actually being able to change systems that are so entrenched, especially when you look at what we now call Canada. These are very difficult discussions, and it's rooted in privilege. If we want to see any change on Turtle Island, then people will have to give up privilege. We've spoken a lot about how people have benefited from the violent dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples in this on these lands, something that continues today in real time. We saw examples over the last month. I did a speech in the House of Commons talking about how the genocide against Indigenous peoples in this country is so normalized that they took down a door with a chainsaw and an axe and a sniper gun, and it barely made the news. So bringing those conversations to the forefront takes a lot of courage. It takes resisting common narratives that perpetuate privilege, privilege that is born in this place on the backs of Indigenous peoples, and I would argue all BIPOC peoples, as we have witnessed during the pandemic on the front lines of even keeping food on the shelves, and pushing an agenda. But how we resist. And I'm not a policer of activism. I think that I just want to see people act. But the place that it comes from, I know for me personally, even if, however I've chosen to resist in my life, it extends from some of the greatest warrior teachings that I've been given, which it has to come from a place of kindness and love. It has to come from a place of hope and vision. That's sometimes to do it in that way, resisting in that way, to center work in that way, I find really powerful. You know, I'm in the most colonial institution that ever existed, the House of Commons. This is the place where they wrote the Indian Act and passed the Indian Act. This is the same place where the rights of Indigenous peoples, I would say BIPOC peoples, minimum human rights for people on Turtle Island right now are up for debate every single day. So I do think change takes resistance. It's easy to follow the line. It's easy to follow the line because when you follow the line, you never get pushback. You never have your privilege threatened. But when you resist from a place of love, from a place of kindness, truth, honesty, based in fact, based on what we call the rule of law, which is actually the Constitution, which includes international law, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, human rights conventions we have signed onto, something that is violated in this country on a daily in this House of Commons, you get pushback. And I do think we need some resistance. I think we're at a critical juncture. Our world is on the line. We're in a climate emergency. We're in a human rights crisis. We are, from what I believe is a growing corporate dictatorship, where we see the Amazon guy flying to space in a rocket ship and people in Winnipeg Center rolling out on the streets because they're getting cut off of CCB and GIS. And resistance, resisting that greed, resisting that narrative that have supported inequality and human rights violations here and around the globe. I absolutely think we need to have a resistance against that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. I'll turn things over to Aisha Khan, who is going to take on another question for us.
So the question that I'm thinking about is, in a world that seems so often divided on issues of rights and access, what can we do to bring people together? So I think a lot about this, like probably many of you and why you're on this call on International Human Rights Day. So I start by saying there is a place for resistance. I am with some of the most fearless resistors on this panel. So there's a place for resistance. There's a place for advocacy, for agitation, for calling out, for demonstration, for protest. That's natural, that's part of us, and I'm glad we have it, because if we didn't, we wouldn't move laws, we wouldn't move business, even though days sometimes it feels like we're not doing those things. So I start by saying that, so we need that. The risk sometimes is, or the caution is, that sometimes resistance, the framework of resistance can, depending on how you look at it, I think position a them and us. Sometimes that's for good, and we need it. and that's how we make change, sometimes I think it sets us back. And so I think often about, how do we bring people together? So for years I did, I was in an adversarial system, human rights system. So advocating against discrimination, trying to bring resolutions between some business or government or large institution who's doing the wrong thing, who's infringing on rights. And part of what I learned, and I'm wiser now than I was, yesterday, minutes ago, I would say, yesterday and then 10 years before that. But I've learned that patience, that there's a role for patience in bringing people together. Because I think, if you think about, Louise talked about the fundamental principles of human rights. I mean, embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is this idea that we can root out ignorance. Well, you root out ignorance through education, and that flows through, and education isn't just going to a class, education is just opening your mind to learning. And so when I think about how we bring people together, it's giving people some space to sometimes make mistakes and space to learn. And I don't think that is the appropriate reaction. So don't, take this to be the blueprint for how we do this, because I don't have that either. So there are appropriate times to allow space for discussion and learning and growth. And there are certain times where there's no room for that because we need to, clamp down on what's happening around us in a very aggressive and assertive way. But I think it's our job to look for those, I talk about those ties that bind us. And I think about some of the things that sort of, I don't want to say irk me, but, why is it that this particular issue gets all the media attention and there's rallies and protests on this? And then I know that this is happening and nobody even bats an eyelash or thinks about it. And what is it? Because we feel that we can relate to the cause. It's a story about a mom, a hockey player, a newcomer, something that someone can relate in their human experience. So those are the ties that bind us. Because if we look deep enough, we have a lot of shared experience. And I think if we focus a little bit on that, it just brings us a little bit closer, because when you dig into that deep stuff, I mean, that's where we really make change. I believe in systemic change, but systemic change comes from individual action. And so I always say to people, choose your path of resistance. You might be sharing a social media post. It might be standing out somewhere with like a big sign. It might be writing a letter. It might be just talking to your one friend and telling them what you actually think. And all of those things have ripples of change, however you choose your path of resistance. And most people, I know, I will hazard my fellow panelists and probably everyone on this call, you choose your path of resistance in that leading up to that moment, because it will look different every time. There's no formula. So how do we bring people together? We find the issues and the experience that ties us together. And we only do that, I think, through exploration and real hard work to learn and listen to others. That felt preachy, but it is kind of what I think. So I'll move on.
Thanks very much, Aisha. So I'll turn things over to Brienne Lavallee-Heckert, who will take on the next question.
So I'm going to be answering the question, how can we ensure institutions like academia, the public service, and the arts respect our nations, our people, when hiring and promoting people who claim to be one of us when they are not? I chose this question for a couple of reasons. One, in my own experience, that issue has been really formative in my own understanding of human rights and resistance. And secondly, I think for my nation, I'm seeing a lot of Métis people who are really hurt by the amount of people in institutions who are falsely claiming to be Métis or to be of our people when they are not. And so I wanted to speak to that because because I think it's the conversation that I need to have. But so while I was in law school, I also worked as a parliamentary research assistant for a senator who represents Manitoba. And also in that office, there was somebody who was falsely claiming to be Métis. They were from a well-documented community that's not actually Métis in Quebec. Gerald Leroux's research has been extensive on that, as well as multiple court cases finding that there was no Indigenous community in this place. And so, I as a good Métis girl, I was raised to always speak up whenever there was something that I saw as wrong and that needed to be righted. It's just the way that I was taught to be, like, proud to be Métis and proud to defend our identity. So I told the senator that I worked for about this, and was subsequently gaslit and harassed. I went through all of the bells and whistles as is necessary. I filed a formal harassment complaint, and the result of that was that it came back that they were simply managing cultural identity issues in the office. And this had a devastating impact on me. I was a freshly graduate from law school. I had the senator who I was working for tell me that I breached the feminist workplace policy in coming forward about this, telling me that despite having graduated from law school, all of these things. And that's really hard to hear, especially as, an Indigenous woman in those institutions. They're not made for us. And so, yeah, it was really, really difficult to mentally, accept what was happening to me. And I think that sentiment, I'm seeing a lot of that on social media from other Métis people who are dealing with these issues. The person who was falsely claiming to be Métis faced no consequences. This is despite the fact that this person was, working on legislation to amend the Indian Act. And yeah, just wild, like, how can this actually be true? As an Indigenous woman, I'm presenting all these facts, there's court cases that should mean something to, somebody who legislates Canadian law. And yeah, so I think just that accepting that, my truth isn't what people wanted to hear. And they were going to gaslight me out of the institution. They wanted me gone. And I think it took me a really long time to get to a place where I can accept that it's not personal. Those institutions don't want living Indigenous people. Those institutions are premised on the idea that Indigenous people have been exterminated from these lands. There's no way that Canada can see itself as legitimate and also recognize that we are sovereign peoples, because they are illegally occupying our lands. So I had to, deal with all of the repercussions of speaking up. It was not easy. I had to really, I got to a crisis point because of it. Gaslighting is a really, really dangerous thing that people do without questioning, and do it on impulse without thinking about the consequences. But like all things, I found hope in my people, in my culture, in my nation, in our laws, in our languages, especially. Our languages, and speaking as a Métis person, thinking of Michif, Cree, Anishinaabe, and they distinguish between living and dead things. There are animate and inanimate things. There's no female, male, like in French or whatever. And I think that's when I realized Canada is a dead thing. Canada's laws, Canada, the idea of Canada, it's dead. There's no life there. And we're not going to find solutions if we keep, trying to make change in those institutions that really are not going to. And so, and something I experienced at a very personal level. I did all the things necessary. I got the letters, I did what I was supposed to do, and it didn't matter. It really didn't. They didn't care. And so, being the Métis woman that I am, screw that. I'm going to go build my own thing. And that's how, my involvement with Red River Echoes took shape this past year. And so for me, human rights and resistance in 2021 has looked like building up systems that are living, because the climate crisis is real. And, I just saw an article the other day about food prices rising next year, and I have to think about how we're going to be feeding our communities, because it's not going to be in grocery stores. It's going to be from the land. The land has sustained us for generations. And, that's where we need to go back to. And that's where life is. It's being in those institutions, those places that are just filled with, trees that have been cut and killed to build, and bricks that have no life. Going into the land where there's life is just so healing, and so many of us need to do that. And so I think, human rights and resistance is the decisions we each make every single day about what's right. And yeah, I'm really excited to be working with Red River Echoes now. And so to answer the question, I don't think that there's any hope in those institutions for them to ever respect who we are. And for the last, 140 years, 50 years that Manitoba has been a province, we still don't have our land. And I'm not waiting another 150 years. Marcy.
Thank you very much. Pass things over to Louise.
There's advantages and disadvantages to going last. I'm not exactly sure how I will follow that. But what I will say in terms of the question that I am responding to is, what shapes and forms of resistance do you engage in, and why? So I'm going to start with the why. So the kind of advocacy that I do is born out of both persecution, but also a recognition of privilege. And so there is this really weird juxtaposition and contradiction where I found, and my family found, safety and security from a genocide in my home country of Burundi that claimed anywhere from 100,000 to maybe 500,000 lives. Nobody really knows because it wasn't really counted. In the past year, they just started exhuming the bodies of people that are buried in mass graves from 1972, and just trying to figure out with my mom, because my aunt and uncles and my grandfather are in those graves, how to commemorate that. That said, I also know that I, in living in Canada, am directly benefiting from genocide here. And so what do I do with that? And I think it involves working on multiple issues at multiple levels, and being really honest that even as a refugee, I had a disproportionate access to education, that in some ways my family was better off than people in the village where we were. And that being a citizen in Canada affords certain privileges. I have stable employment. And so there is a huge obligation that goes along with that, knowing how differently my life turned out and how problematic my positioning living here in Winnipeg in Canada is. So working at different levels. So the first is really wanting to make an immediate and tangible difference in the lives of specific individuals. So that involves, like, I am working with a group trying to put together greater capacity and volunteers and getting them trained to work with refugee claimants that arrive in Canada seeking refuge. Recognizing so many people that are economically excluded. So through my work with SEED, trying to work with them to achieve greater financial stability in a really immediate way, like getting like actual dollars into people's hands. Anti-racism letter writing group that we just started last month. We wrote on the case of Hussein Chilil Idris and made exactly the same points that you did. Like, it's great that the two Michaels arrived. That's great that there was so much attention on them. But why, after over a decade, is he still in prison in China if he's truly a Canadian citizen? And then the next level is working for systemic change by advocating change in terms of policies and practices. So the issue that Leah raised about clawbacks to GIS, and it was just so lovely meeting with you, Leah. And like, you're the one who raised the issue, and you're like just as mad about it as we are in terms of the impact of people that are having their benefits cut because of CERB and all of those other things. And so it's just great to have that sort of allyship happening, and knowing that we have a voice inside of Parliament around some of the systemic change that we want. The police accountability work is part of that policy change. And then like advocating with different sort of government services that have really like accelerated their shift to sort of virtual and online service delivery. And so that leaves so many people that don't have the technology, the people that need those essential services the most, it leaves them completely out in the cold. And so trying to get places like Service Canada, CRA to either introduce or ramp up their in-person service delivery so that those people can get what they're actually entitled to. And then the other piece, and I totally hear you, Brianna, like, so all of this is about working within existing institutions to try and make life better for people in the here and now, but recognizing that those institutions are part of a really oppressive system, and we need, and your language is really powerful, and I'm going to reflect on that in terms of those institutions being dead. We need to create alternatives that are healthier, that are rooted in the values that we all adhere to. So both social institutions, particularly economic institutions. So part of the work at SEED is creating co-ops, social enterprises that are based on a very different ethos than profit maximizing firms, which is the dominant form of business. And then finally, or not so finally, supporting the emergence of community leaders. So just launched a human rights education project for newcomers. And really wanting to provide training around human rights as well as advocacy skills. One of the core pieces of the curriculum is going to be about Indigenous rights, and then having these leaders go out into their communities and really translate that information in a way that can be understood, so that we can build more of a sense of allyship and understanding. And then the final piece, which is probably the hardest part actually, but something that we don't talk about, is just trying as much as I can to reflect the values that I espouse in my day-to-day lives. Like, so in terms of where I work, where I shop, like all of those like day-to-day decisions, they're also part of creating the kind of society that we want in the future. Yeah, so those are my, I think there's 5. I started off with 3, but as people talked, I added more. So yeah.
Thank you very much for those incredibly rich and really kind of prescient responses to those questions. So we're going to begin kind of a second round of going kind of around the virtual table on these questions. And folks had indicated a question they were particularly interested in responding to. And I'll ask you to take that second one on and remember to read it out just so the rest of the folks know what you're going to be speaking to. And it's also a moment where we can also think about responding to other things that may have come up as well. So I'll just pass things over to Idris.
Thank you. I think it's the same question that Louise just addressed, which is what trips and forms of resistance do you engage in and why? I think certain causes, they have a way of forcing themselves on us. Certain issues have a way of forcing themselves on us. And sometimes we accept a low-level conflict, but when that conflict flares up and it's intense, high-level conflict, then we kind of forces the issue on us. And this happens a lot with, where I come from, Palestine. There's been for the past century or plus low-level conflict, and then once in a while it spikes into intense conflict, intense suffering, and intense bloodshed. And this happened again this past spring. And what I found myself struggling with was the desire and to talk about it, to share it with others, and then being actively muzzled and shut down by institutions. I was finally, for example, able to share some things through CBC Manitoba Online, but even that was a difficult process back and forth until it was able to get to the point where they would publish something. So I think one form of the resistance that I've been thinking about and maybe working on is to resist erasure of the stories, erasure of the history, erasure of the narratives. My grandmother, she fled in 1948 and lived out her life in diaspora in Syria, and I for many years I wasn't able to see her, and I saw her a few years before she passed away, and I made a point of recording her oral history, and I go back to that once in a while, and then I convey that to my kids, and hopefully the story lives on. And I think that is a very important form of resistance, is to ensure that the stories live on. Our home library has books about Palestine, but books about, like children's books written by Indigenous authors that celebrate that culture and share it. And this is again a way for us to keep our story alive, but to learn about other stories, even the food we cook. We talk about the land and how you live with the land. And, one thing that we, not me, but, my ancestors who lived off the land, there's this connectedness, this love for the land. The land gives you everything, and then you give it back your soul. And so we talk to the kids about how the food we cook, where it comes from, how we you take advantage of everything and don't waste anything, how we moderate our consumption, and so on, to live in harmony with the land that gives us all of these gifts. So I think it's important to ensure that our stories are not erased, and whether we share them with others, and whether they live on through our children and those who are willing to listen to our stories. I think this is an important form of resistance. And I think it's not as easy as it sounds. There's always those who are going to try to suppress those stories and prevent them from receiving a wider audience.
Thank you very much. I'll pass things over to Leah Gazan.
Thank you so much. And powerful, Idris, talking about erasure. That's just so powerful. I think that's something that we're reeling with now on Turtle Island. And, something that is both negative but positive in the way that, in my own journey of reconciling, I've met a lot of people across the way that come from different backgrounds, different stories, different places, and finding a way to have a discussion and sit in a circle. That's been very healing for me, certainly in the faith community, for me personally. I wanted to talk about something, maybe it's weird, but I want to talk about joy as an act of resistance. So I grew up, my father was a Holocaust survivor, only surviving child. Many people know my story. 5 survivors in total. My dad was the only surviving child. So the fact that I'm here is a gift. Being the descendant of the only surviving child. that is unthinkable. Like it's like my life is a gift. And my mom, an Indigenous Chinese woman, Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, grew up in child welfare, 5 to 18, 15 years old, aged out of care. Marge, you're 18, you're on your own. Ended up becoming an award-winning psychiatric nurse because they were hiring people actually to take psychiatric training, because it was at a time where where people with mental health issues living in institutions had no human rights. So they were actually paying people to do the job. It was a terrible environment. Ended up changing mental health legislation, award-winning researcher. My parents were kind of miracles, when you look at what they came from. The fact that they figured it out, and I had a semi-normal life, it's kind of a miracle. But my whole life, I think the way they survived it is always being involved in activism. whether it be, I was talking about different kinds of activism. My dad lost a job for wearing a peace button in the 60s. Like my dad was a bit reckless, like, he's a whistleblower. My mom, same thing, like, but I think that's how they survived their atrocities, by working together to fight for a better world. And so I grew up in it. And so there wasn't a time where I wasn't involved in the human rights movements of all kinds, like the anti-apartheid movement, even in Winnipeg. I remember going to fundraisers. And then when I was about 40, it wasn't too long ago, about 10 years ago now, yeah, I'm lying in bed and I'm burnt out. I'm a full-time academic. I'm, did, I don't know, more stuff, doing community organizing all the time, working like 17 hours a day. And I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, I'm burnt out, I'm miserable. I never take any time. I'm working all the time. And then it came to me. I was like, I'm doing this because I'm fighting for the right to joy. I'm fighting for the right to joy for myself, my son, my family, my community, for all people, because when you come from oppressed groups and when you violate human rights, you strip people of their right to joy. And so living my joy as somebody who comes from genocides from two parts of the world is a revolutionary act. So my balance as I get older is to keep fighting for human rights. That's still a focus. But now part of my struggle has been learning how to fight for my joy, because if I don't know how to have that joy myself, what am I fighting for? And that has been a powerful lesson that I've learned in my own life from my own failings. Because these are hard fights. These are can be spirit ripping fights. So to remind myself by having that joy when I'm fighting for, whether it's cooking, even doing things like cooking, exercising in the morning, spending time with my family, talking weird to my dog, that to me has become part of that. I just thought I would add that. Joy as an act of resistance, joy as an act of revolution. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for that. Passing over to Aisha Khan.
So I was going to talk about a question about how do we ensure institutions like academia, public service, the arts respect our nations and people when they're hiring and promoting people. So I'm on that journey, building a representative workforce. Talked for years about building a representative workforce. What do I mean? A workforce, a work environment that's representative of the community that we serve, that's around us. And so it was all good when it's words and it's equality of opportunity and it's basic principles of human rights that we all talk about. And more recently, I think a little bit about what we have to do to ensure that we can do that. And the care that we have to, institutions need to take. Like I think about Brienne's story, right? And then the path that follows from that, which is, I don't want to be in these institutions. I need to create my own because this will never change. And who knows, maybe we disagree, maybe we do agree. It doesn't matter, we're all going to come at our work in different ways. What I can say is my reflection is representation matters, but those institutions have to be ready to bring in those new ideas. So it's not really earth-shattering, but they do. And I know that my journey, so, I'm a first-generation Winnipegger, Canadian. My parents immigrated from Pakistan in the early 70s. And I talk often about the immense privilege I have, privilege of all kinds in the life that I've been given. And when people look to me and would say, what's that one moment that made you want to think about human rights and advocate for human rights? And they wanted to hear this story of egregious racism. And I'd say, well, I don't really have that story. I'm privileged and fortunate. I have certainly many, many instances of othering and feeling different and all of those things. But compare them to some of the stories that I know of people I care about and work with and work along. I don't have a story. But now I think more about, we do have a story where when we bring in people of color, people, you'll never hear me talk about the diverse population because I don't know what that means. We're already a diverse population and people want to build more. We have to remember that people are navigating their history, their path, their connection to their families, and institutions have to be ready for that. Because how it plays out is this thing that happens inside of me all the time, which is, I know what I need to do, and I know I need to do things in a certain way, but there's this part of me that's always wondering, I have my feet in two places. I feel some experience that I can share, and there's something I can't always explain. And so I often go to other people of color, people with racialized experiences, and find that interconnectedness of our experience, those ties. I think that institutions need to think about that. I shudder sometimes when I think about the speed at which some institutions are trying to diversify their workforces. And I don't mean that we should be slow, but what I mean is that we're just going to hire these people, and in 1 year, we're going to 1 in 2 people is going to look like this and believe in that. And there comes with wonderful intentions. But I think what we actually need those institutions to do is think about why are we doing this? Because we're creating space for qualified, great people who've been there all along that we just didn't pay attention to. And that's different than that targeted approach to diversity that you hear a lot about, of equity building. And I think that's what sometimes pulls away from the real human rights conversations, is it then becomes the plan and the framework that's going to change things overnight. I think every one of us knows that it's 2021 and this is going to take a while. I mean, if we really want to live out human rights, it's going to take a while. And so, like I think Brianne's comment earlier was, I have hope in our youth. So do I. I'm going to do the best that I can do, but it's our youth who have who give us hope that we're going to really move the way that we think that we live. So institutions need to think about the people they bring in and not just the objective and the numbers. They need to think about how they're going to care for them, how they're going to respect the difficulty those people may have in that moment. They can't, we talk about the immense shouldering of responsibility Indigenous people with racialized experience have. Black people have to carry that they are going to tell everyone else how to do this. And I think it's on institutions to figure it out, to listen, but to be caring for the people that they bring in. Otherwise, those people will never thrive. And that's all of us. So again, that's just building a culture of good humanity for your fellow citizen, which shouldn't be so hard to do.
Thank you very much. Pass things over to Brienne.
Yeah, the next question that I'll be speaking to is how do Indigenous rights and human rights intersect, and how do they differ? So I have a lot of thoughts about that. But I think I actually want to problematize human rights and just that concept generally. And in particular, the word rights and what that function does, and the ways in which rights and human rights in particular, have been co-opted by the state. Kostas Douznas, a human rights theorist, talks about how human rights have become a discourse of state legitimacy, that states use those languages of human rights to make them seem as if they are doing things. And I can't think of a better example than what's going on in Wet'suwet'en territory right now. The province of British Columbia has adopted the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and doesn't really seem to care. And I think that that's obviously a huge issue if states are able to pick and choose when they are honoring their rights commitments. And further to problematizing the idea of human rights, I think we also need to problematize the United Nations as the source of human rights law. The Charter of the United Nations is premised on the idea of state sovereignty. That is a core principle of why the United Nations was even able to function and exist as a global body. And through that, the United Nations reinforces state legitimacy. And so as an Indigenous person, as Indigenous peoples, I think that we're putting too many eggs in the UN basket when we should be putting those eggs in our own communities and in our own laws and our own traditions. Just another anecdote of why the UN isn't going to be the solution is thinking about the 2019 Human Rights Committee decision that came out from the UN, the United Nations Human Rights Committee. They found Canada in breach of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights because of sex discrimination in the Indian Act. And I just think that decision is so funny to be celebrated because there's still an Indian Act. Great that there's no sex-based discrimination, but it's still a genocidal policy. And the United Nations, great, made Canada's genocidal policy not sexist. Great, is that really the best that we can do and can hope for? I don't know. So I just think that the UN as an institution is a place that we have to think about within the context of colonialism, and that even the fact that the United Nations, UNDRIP itself, that it's a declaration and not a covenant, I think shows the fact that, and just for, I guess, to clarify, so declarations are not legally binding in law. Covenants, like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, is binding as international law. If the UN was serious about Indigenous rights, why not make it a treaty? Why make it a declaration that's soft and not binding? So I think the distinction between Indigenous rights and human rights, I think, is largely a false binary that's created by the state. And I think it also points to me that we need to start understanding rights and responsibilities outside of the state. And we need to start thinking about rights and responsibilities within the context of relationships with yourself, relationships with your community, relationships with the land, with the animals, with the plants, because change is never going to happen if we're still relying on these systems, as I've said. And I think just to end with another example, I think about my relationship with water a lot. That's a big, sorry, the sun is really shining here. I think about water. And I think about how I rely on water to survive, and my body is made up of mostly water. And that my relationship with water is something that, I have to think about within the context of the intersection of human rights and Indigenous rights, because I am water. And until we can get to a place where we're thinking about ourselves as not just stewards of the land, but as part of the land, we rely on that, that's who we are. And yeah, I guess if we all were thinking more about water, maybe things would be better. Yeah, so I guess just, wanted to say that I think that we should look to other places for ideas of what human rights can mean. And we should push those boundaries because the UN does not have a monopoly on rights. Marcy.
Thank you very much. I will pass things over to Louise.
Okay, so the question that I chose is, how has human rights advocacy been impacted by COVID-19? And what are the challenges and opportunities of our new normal? Yeah, so I guess maybe the positive side in some ways is that there are issues that me and other advocates have been working on for years and years and years that just didn't resonate or that didn't, or that people just couldn't absorb in terms of what it meant. And I think what's happened with COVID-19 is it has brought both global and local inequities and divisions to the foreground, and made them really visible in a way that's hard to ignore, and in some ways creates an opening for us to have discussions that I think would have been very difficult before. And conversely, like in terms of talking about inequities and divisions, I think it's also really made it obvious how interconnected we all are. And I think the emergence of the Omicron variant is a great example of that in terms of the inequities in terms of global vaccine distribution, and how that is impacting all of us globally, and is maybe going to take away Christmas for a bunch of us. The other thing that I think has become really obvious, and I think there's an intersection between sort of COVID-19 and also what's happening in terms of environmental degradation, is it's also made it really obvious how fragile our supply chains are. And people who I don't think I could have had conversations about the importance of supporting local economies, locally owned enterprises, trying to create alternative economic systems. Like, I think there's an opening to have those discussions and to start thinking about how we build sort of more of a resilient economic system that isn't sort of completely driven by the profit motive. On the other hand, I think it has made it much more challenging to build and maintain social bonds and community, which I think is really an important piece of advocacy and activism. I delayed launching the Human Rights Education Project. It was funded by the Winnipeg Foundation, I think 3 years ago, and waiting. And when COVID hit, that brought everything to a screeching halt, because I really wanted the project to be part of building a community of support, and I couldn't imagine how to do that. And so finally, like, recognizing that we are in this new normal, like I could be delaying the project for years, decided to launch it and to try and think really creatively about how in a virtual setting we will be able to create that sense of community and those social bonds. And so I think we're going to be really stretched in terms of how we do that. I'm so glad we made the decision to launch the project. I'm receiving all the applications from youth, from people that have been in Canada for 2 years, 2 months to like 20 years, and just super inspiring in terms of the work that they're already doing and their excitement about the work that they want to do in their community. Yeah, so that's maybe a short answer to a really big question.
We're specializing in the big questions today, and that is, of course, appropriate. So we're coming up on our time now, and I just wanted to ask if any of the panelists had a final thought, whether it is something they would have told their younger self, whether that is yesterday or a decade ago or more, or a question that people from the audience might take with them. We can maybe just have another couple of minutes on those if you just want to unmute yourself and weigh in if you have a parting thought you'd like to leave our audience with, or leave each other with too, I should say.
I had a thought.
Great.
I think this was, I'm saying this also not to just like the younger version of myself, but to other Indigenous youth who may find themselves in positions where they're being tokenized. But I think it would be, you can share your truth without sharing your trauma. And I think that that's a really big boundary that as young Indigenous peoples and all Indigenous peoples, we really, actually all peoples, you know, learn how to share your truth without sharing your trauma. And I think that for me has been a big learning.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else have a interest?
I can share a couple of bits. One is do not underestimate small wins. I think that's important to celebrate even the smallest of wins, and to avoid becoming bitter and cynical, because those are the things that will kill your activism and your work.
I think in a very similar vein, I would say, look for change. Like, look for it. It's actually there. You know, we get defeated sometimes because we think of the big stuff and why aren't things moving the way they ought to? But sometimes it is the tiniest moment, like between you and someone else, or that you even overhear between two people. And if you reflect on it, I mean, that's what change looks like. That I think that matters just as much as the big stuff, because that's what's kind of getting us there. So, yeah.
And I would say that I felt really validated by the comments from Isha and Leah. At first, like when I wrote down my notes to this question, I thought, oh, this sounds really namby-pamby and soft. But I was like, but I totally believe this. And then when you guys made the comments, I was like, okay, I can say this. And so for me, it's like really focusing on the who and the how in terms of activism, and not on the what. So instead of focusing on ideological purity or the positions that are taken on a particular issue or campaign, it's more about just recognizing that things are messy, full of contradictions, and it's more about who you do it with and how they're approaching the work. And so that ethos of keep treating each other with kindness, with love, giving each other the benefit of the doubt, and working in a way that builds those stronger social bonds and sense of community, like recognizing that everybody's going to make mistakes, that there's so much that's problematic about pretty well everything that we do. Super easy to criticize, much harder to work together, and try, and even if it's just a tiny little victory, like I love what you said, Idris, about celebrating that. I don't think we do that enough, and we need to, because this is really hard work. It's like a salmon swimming upstream. So thank you all. Lots of food for thought.
I just want to thank everybody on the panel. It was such a rich panel. I think one of the things that guides me is to always be true to who you are, and to always be honest, and to walk with humility, and to never let your ego interfere with something good, even if it means that you have to change your mind. And so I'll leave it at that, and thank everybody on the panel for all your beautiful insights and words today.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for what was a really remarkable and rich and challenging and important conversation. And I am grateful for everyone's engagement and participation here. And I also want to just take a moment to thank a number of people who you have not necessarily seen here. One of them is Dr. Shana Plout, the acting manager of the Center for Human Rights Research, whose work and vision was absolutely critical to this. So thank you very much to Shana. Also, thank you to Kayla LaRiviere and to Corey Petznick for their work, and to our friends at the University of Manitoba Press for their contributions to this event as well. And unless anybody else has any closing word, Brienne, did you have something you wanted to, or are you?
I don't, but
okay. I wasn't sure. I was sort of losing track of who had their closing words. I just wanted to make sure we were all good, and I just wanted to thank you all for all of the work, all of the thoughts, all of the genius and commitment that has been on display here, and at the end of what has been a remarkable year. And this was a remarkable panel. So thank you very much.